What's good, everybody? It's Court here, checking in with you all from the underground. Thank you for everybody that supported my recent video where I go into a pretty interesting topic, nerd ideology versus street ideology. And I really would love to kind of get more of your thoughts and feedback and comments on that video. So please make sure you go back and watch that video. And I kind of feel like it's a precursor to today's conversation. So definitely check that out. But even more importantly, continue to support the channel with a subscription, with a like, with sharing a video to anybody that you know that might be a fellow nerd or just could better understand you better if you are a nerd. Share it with somebody. And let's continue to grow the community. So, today, we're actually going to have a little bit of different conversation. Obviously, we're talking about nerds, hence the nature of the channel. But today, we won't be talking about nerds as a stereotype. So, no discussion about pocket protectors and, no awkward caricatures, no punchlines. We're talking about nerds as an archetype. So, again, definition of archetype, again, is a reoccurring type of human being that shows up across history, across geology, across geography, rather, and across power structures. Because if you zoom out far enough, something uncomfortable but undeniable becomes clear. And it's nerds don't just exist in society, we actually reshape it. And we do this quietly. Sometimes we do it reluctantly, and it's usually without asking for permission. So, today, let's break down some of the major nerd archetypes and really throughout history, honestly, and not just what they do, but where they were, where they emerged, why they may have thought the way they do, um, and how modern nerds are inheriting power that past generations may have never had access to. But before we get into archetypes, we need clarity. Um, So we're going to start with definitions. Again, I gave the definition of an archetype already. So let's give the definition of a nerd, just to level set and making sure that everybody has an understanding of the definitions that I will be using for this discussion. So we're all on the same page. So, and again, a nerd isn't defined by their hobbies. A nerd is defined by orientation. So again, definition of a nerd: a person who is extremely enthusiastic or knowledgeable about a particular subject, especially one of specialist or niche interest. And again, I'm just going to read it again. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but a definition of an archetype, just so we can have that right there next to each other. A very typical example of a certain person or thing, or a recurrent symbol or motif in literature, art, or mythology, right? So, proceeding. At their core, nerds prioritize systems over status, and I might have said that in a previous video, value truth over approval, and they invest in mastery over performance. Nerds aren't optimized to really just be forced to stay in a room or be forced to fit into a box. Um, they're optimized for models, tools, infrastructures, and long timelines like growth mindset, um, strategic building. And this is why nerds often look misunderstood early and disproportionately influential later on. Rephrasing that, people don't like nerds at the beginning when they first meet them, when they first have to interact with them. Eventually, later on, everybody jumps on the bandwagon. It's like, oh, they're a pretty cool guy. No, we need that nerd. So, one of the oldest nerd archetypes in recorded history is we'll call the philosopher or the heretic, right? And this archetype emerges when societies believe their moral and spiritual frameworks are settled. And someone quietly asks, what if the foundation itself is flawed? Clear example of this person or this archetype is a person by the name of Baruch Spinoza. And Spinoza lived in the 17th century Amsterdam, a global trade hub and one of the most intellectually tolerant cities in Europe at that time. And its Jewish community had only recently fled persecution in Iberia, meaning survival depended on cohesion, obedience, and doctrinal clarity, right? And into that fragile environment, Spinoza introduced a dangerous idea that God, nature, ethics, and human behavior could be understood through reason alone, not tradition, not hierarchy, not institutional authority. And this wasn't really rebellion or trying to be rebellion. No, it was just logic. In 1656, at just the age of 23 years old, Spinoza was actually excommunicated in one of the harshest bans ever recorded. People were forbidden from speaking of him, reading his work, or even standing near him. He wasn't debated, he wasn't disproven, he wasn't removed. And that's how the philosopher or the heretic nerd is typically treated historically. When you can't defeat the logic, you isolate the thinker. And today, this archetype still lives on. And we can see this in the independent thinker or an independent essayist, right? People that produce long form YouTube videos, right? Thinkers, like maybe someone like me. Um, and people who question sacred narratives without spectacle. They don't typically start revolutions. They just quietly make old frameworks intellectually impossible to maintain. The next archetype is the empirical organizer nerd. And yes, maybe some of these archetype names are a little long winded, but just humor me. I put the work in, you're watching the video, stay in your place. So, again, in the empirical organizer nerd. This is the one who enters chaos and makes it legible. And a defining example of this archetype is a woman by the name of Florence Nightingale. She lived in 19th century Britain during the Industrial Revolution, a period of rapid urbanization, overcrowding, and institutions collapsing under scale. During the Crimean War, British soldiers weren't dying gloriously in battle. No, they were actually dying in hospitals from infection, filth, and poor sanitation. And this suffering wasn't framed as a systems failure, it was framed just as fate. But Nightingale, she rejected that framing and she did something about that. She actually started gathering data, tracked causes of death, created visual charts, including the earliest model infographics that made institutional failure undeniable. And these charts reached Parliament, and they actually embarrassed leadership. They forced reform, hospitals were redesigned, sanitation standards changed, and military medicine was transformed. So, the empirical organizer nerd doesn't moralize, they force reality into the conversation using data and statistics and examples. This archetype also shows up in present day as a data analyst or a user experience or a product researcher and anybody that works in operations or is a policy designer. So if you're the person who brings numbers into emotional debates, this might be you. And then there's the most quietly powerful archetype of them all, the infrastructure nerd. And this nerd understands a very brutal truth. Whoever designs the system shapes the behavior inside it. And a defining figure here that correlates with this archetype is a man by the name of John von Neumann. And this guy was born in Budapest in 1903 into Europe that was sliding toward collapse. And he witnessed an entire empire break down, the rise of fascism, and a global war. And he immigrated to the United States and worked on computer architecture, game theory, economic modeling, and nuclear strategy. The von Neumann architecture still underpins how most computers function today. And he didn't argue culture, he didn't dominate socially. He just designed frameworks everyone else had to live inside. And infrastructure nerds don't win debates, they just set defaults. So rather than being a player in the game, they made the game that you have to play. And we can see that in today's real life as well too, as back-end cloud engineers, a platform architect, and a payment or logistic designer. Anybody that has to build a system that you have to use. Good example of this archetype. And if you control the system again, you don't need to control the narrative because you make it. Another critical archetype is the cultural translator nerd. And this nerd lives between worlds, intellectual and cultural, and translate reality across boundaries others struggle to cross. And a good example of this archetype is a person by the name of Frantz Fanon. And he was born in Martinique, trained in France, and worked in Algeria during colonial rule. And he treated patients whose identity and mental health had been reshaped by systematic violence. And he didn't just study oppression politically, he studied it psychologically. And his work fused psychiatry, sociology, political theory, and lived experience together. And that made him dangerous to simplistic narratives. Um, and institutions found him a little bit too radical. Communities sometimes found him a little too analytical. And the cultural translator nerd often belongs nowhere and everywhere at the same time. It's a terrible spot to be in, right? Um, and you can see this archetype also in modern times as maybe an off the wall thinker, maybe a conspiracy theorist to some degree, I would say. Um, anybody that's maybe an academic adjacent and that's a creative, and people that translate systems language into cultural insight. So if you've ever felt too analytical for one space and maybe too real for another, this might be you. And the final archetype that we'll discuss in this video is the strategist nerd. Historically, strategists emerge in places where survival depends on anticipation, not brute force. So think about ancient military theorists, Renaissance political advisors, and Cold War analysts. They survive by reading the map. Modern strategists grow up in games. Totally different. And games teach us resource management, pattern recognition, risk assessment, and delayed gratification. I can relate to all those things again as an avid gamer. So when gamers enter real systems, so maybe like tech, finance, media, they already understand feedback loops that others miss. And if you grew up gaming, you were training. And so uh, For this archetype, I'm actually not going to give anybody in pass. I'm actually going to use myself, right? Or you, maybe even if you're a gamer, things are, and do anything similar to that. This is actually maybe what you are. So to fully understand nerds, you have to understand time. Most cultures reward short cycles, right? Trends, clout, elections. We see that, here in Western culture, in American society, quite often, right? And so nerd archetypes emerged in environments where rushing decisions got people killed. So, Spinoza lived through religious wars. Nightingale worked in collapsing institutions. Von Neumann lived also through a war scenario, total war. And Fanon operated under colonial repression. Across geography and centuries, nerds learned the same lesson. Speed without modeling is danger. And we'll also say maybe speed without caution is danger as well too. So nerds evolved to really employ patience, maybe more effectively than other types of people. I would say maybe they simulate. They hesitate on purpose oftentimes, and they think past the moment to the moments beyond, because that's really what you should be always be doing. Think two steps ahead. Sometimes think seven. And this is why nerds often seem late. But they typically tend to survive most cycle collapses as well too. They tend to bounce back, maybe some of the best, we'll say. If you think differently about that, put that in the comments. Let's have a debate about it. And they're not racing to be first. They're not racing to be present. They're actually preparing for what's coming next. So, if you watch this video, I want you to understand something, and it resonates with you. You might find yourself being a nerd, being an outcast, a refugee from any social group, whatever. Insert. You're not behind. You're not awkward, and you're not late. You're just running on a longer timeline. And history doesn't remember the loudest people in the room in a lot of instances. It remembers those who thought deeper, they built better systems that everybody benefited from, and they operated in a way to outlast trends. So that's all we got for today's video. This is Court from Ghost Town Underground. Again, we don't chase rooms. We don't beg to be in spaces. We build new spaces in preparation for the old ones to collapse. This is Court. We out. Peace.